God created all things and declared them good. This is how the book of Genesis begins. It's quite a statement, considering how quickly afterward events seemed to get off track. Nevertheless, it all began well. This passage from Genesis is a helpful reminder of how we ought to view others, giving them the benefit of the doubt rather than assuming the worst. Because this is how God works, so should we. Peter Enns will guide us through the opening chapters of Genesis, trying to help us discern God's intentions. One thing we know for sure, whatever God's intentions were, they were for the good of us all. God began that way and continues to desire the best for all God's people.
You can tell a lot about a book by how it begins and how it ends. Good books have good endings that tie the whole story together. Now, the Bible is the good book that tells the greatest story, and you can tell a lot about the Bible by how it begins and ends. So to begin our exploration of the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis 1 to 2, let's first take a look at how the Bible ends. In the very last chapter of the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the angel shows John a vision of paradise. It is a vision of a new heaven and a new earth and a new Jerusalem. It's a very rich picture. In the middle of that new Jerusalem, that new city, the angel shows John the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. Interesting, isn't it? The Bible ends the same way it begins, in a garden, in paradise, with the tree of life. In a way, the entire Bible is the story of paradise lost and paradise found, a story of reversing the curse, a story of creation, fall, and a new creation. The Bible is the story of how God brings his people back to the garden, back to creation as it was intended to be. Next week, our subject will be how paradise was lost. This week, we begin at the very beginning of the story, paradise itself. And as we begin our study of Genesis, in fact, as we begin our study of the Bible, it is important to begin by asking the right questions. Before we ask, what does this text mean to me, we need to ask, what does this text mean? And that question drops us right in the middle of an ancient world. The story of creation is an ancient story, first told to God's people long ago. Genesis 1 and 2 is not a modern science textbook. It was not written to answer questions we might have about the origins of the universe. It is an ancient book that spoke very clearly and powerfully to God's people living thousands of years before our time. And the central message is this: I am your God. I created everything you see. The heavens and the earth are my doing. Therefore, worship me and no one else. How does Genesis 1 and 2 get this across? Well, there is a very curious element in these chapters that often goes unnoticed at first. Genesis 1 and 2 tell the creation story in two different ways. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 3 gives a very comprehensive view, speaking of the universe created in 6 days, followed by a seventh day of rest. Genesis 2 verses 4 through 25 focuses on Adam and Eve. Taken together, these two stories perform two different but complementary functions in Genesis. To understand this part of Genesis, it is very helpful to have a feel for the ancient world in which the Bible was written. Beginning about 150 years ago, archaeologists discovered some tablets from various ancient Mesopotamian cultures. Carved onto some of these tablets were creation stories of other peoples of the ancient world. The best known of these is the Babylonian creation story. Why is this story so well known? Well, scholars quickly began to see striking similarities and differences between the creation story in Genesis 1 and the Babylonian creation story. The Babylonian account is a fairly long one, and examining all the details is not necessary, but looking at some important similarities and differences between the Babylonian and Genesis creation stories will help establish a sense of context as we read Genesis. Here are four important similarities. The first, the sequence of the days of creation is similar in both stories. First comes the creation of the firmament, then the dry land, then the heavenly lights, the sun, moon, and stars, then humanity, all followed by rest. Second, in both stories, darkness precedes the act of creation. A third similarity, in both stories, there is a division of waters. There's waters above and below. And fourth, in both stories, light exists before the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. These similarities remind us that Genesis was written to speak to a world very different from our own. Ancient peoples had their own pre-scientific ways of thinking about the world. And the amazing thing is that God spoke in Genesis in ways that people then were able to understand. Now, having looked at the similarities between the Genesis creation story and the Babylonian story, some might get the idea that Genesis copied from the Babylonian story, but not so fast. In fact, there's more to tell from the differences between these two stories than from the similarities. Briefly, the Babylonian creation story goes something like this. After several generations of fighting between the gods, one particular god named Marduk kills his enemy Tiamat. And with her slain body, Marduk takes half of it to create the earth and the other half to create the heavens. What makes this story take on the feel of an ancient soap opera is that Tiamat also happens to be Marduk's great-grandmother. Well, so much for ancient stories. To say the least, there's none of this in the creation story in Genesis. It is clearly not a copy of the Babylonian story. Creation, according to the Bible, is not the result of a dysfunctional divine family killing each other off. Rather, Genesis tells us that God acts alone. In fact, God simply speaks things into existence. Throughout Genesis, chapter 1, we read, "Let there be," followed by, "and there was." It may seem strange to think of Genesis side by side with this ancient Babylonian story, but comparing the two shows how Genesis fits, how it makes sense in the ancient world. But it also shows how very radical the Bible was in that ancient context. Remember, everyone in the ancient world had stories like the Babylonians, with many gods in conflict. But along comes this Hebrew people with a message both subversive and countercultural. There is only one God. God alone made all things. God alone reigns supreme. This is important to keep in mind. The very radical message of Genesis challenged the ancient world. And that radical message is that Israel's God is unlike all the other gods. And therefore Israel, God's people, is unlike all the other peoples of the world. In other words, Genesis 1 is not so much about creation as it is about God, about how different God is, and how God's people have a unique self-identity. Genesis 2 continues this theme, but tells the creation story differently than Genesis 1. Instead of describing 6 days of creation with humanity created on the sixth day, Genesis 2 focuses on that most important element of God's creation, human beings. Humanity is the only part of God's creation that is made in God's image. And it is this relationship, God's relationship to people, that will form the backdrop for the rest of the Bible. It is evident that the emphasis in Genesis 2 is on God's relationship to humans. God is not just the God, He is their God. Later on in the Old Testament, this relationship will be called God's covenant. And in the following chapters of Genesis, the story concerns what threatened to destroy that covenantal relationship. And the driving idea throughout the rest of Scripture is the lengths to which God goes to restore that relationship. Israel's God is not like the gods of other nations. God alone is the creator of the world. God is also the creator of a people. The creator God is also the personal God. This is the message of Genesis 1 and 2. And this is the proper starting point for reading the Bible from cover to cover. So as we read the Bible over these next several weeks, watch and see just how distinctive Israel's God is. Pay attention to this God who is creator. Pay attention to this God who is deliverer, delivering the Hebrew people first from Egypt, then later from Babylon, and finally delivering all people once and for all through the death and resurrection of God's Son. That is where this whole story of the Bible is heading, even now in the beginning.